Now, I will admit that going into The Acolyte, I had never seen anything else from Leslie Headland. I had never seen anything else she had ever worked on, which obviously then would include a show like Russian Doll, which I had heard from quite a few people, both online and in my personal life, that it was actually a really good and enjoyable show. And to be honest, hearing that from people who, again, I know and whose opinion I trust and respect, while it partly gave me hope that The Acolyte then might be really good too, because despite what some people think about me, I do always root for Star Wars. I always want to see it be good, and it was no different with The Acolyte. But just because I really want something to be good doesn't mean I will make it good in my head when it is not. That doesn't mean I will bend over backwards to find any and all reasons I can to like it or say nice things about it just because it's Star Wars. And so, though yes, I wanted The Acolyte to be a good show, I wanted to like it, I also did have this little fear in the back of my head that if it ended up being a really, really good show, if Headland was indeed a great writer and storyteller, which you'd assume she is if Lucasfilm had hired her to create a show, and then gave her a budget of about $200 million to make it, but I was a little worried if it was a really, really good show and ended up painting the Jedi in a very negative light, which is something she kind of seemed to be interested in doing when she made some of the comments she did about the show before it came out, about how the show wasn't going to be kind to the Jedi, that it was going to show their flaws. But yeah, I was worried if it was a really well-written show and painted the Jedi in a negative light, that it would give people the wrong impression of what the Jedi are even supposed to be in the first place. I didn't want her to tear down the ideal that is the Jedi because, as I've said many, many times before, but I think valuable life lessons can be taken away from Star Wars, from the Jedi and how they see the world or their galaxy, about how they believe in being selfless over selfish, and that a life of giving is more rewarding and joyous than a life of taking. As I often say, we could all try to be a little more Jedi-like, and if we were, the world would be a better place. Which, no, doesn't mean we should try to literally be just like the Jedi, but rather they again represent an ideal to strive towards, a North Star to guide us when we're perhaps a little lost. They're not, or their way is not, some type of perfection we can or should even fully try to replicate here with our own lives in the real world. They're an example of how to try and be better, not a standard we should measure ourselves against, and when we fall short, which we inevitably will, we shouldn't consider ourselves failures. And to be clear, and this is where people misunderstand me, I think, when I talk about the Jedi, but to be very clear, this is not the same thing as seeing individual Jedi being flawed and making mistakes and falling to the dark side or whatever else bad may happen. Star Wars, after all, is about choices, and even Jedi are, of course, going to make some wrong choices. It's not that I want to see every single Jedi be perfect and infallible. I'll admit that would probably lead to some boring stories. Instead, it's that, again, I don't want to see the Jedi on the whole or as a concept or ideal presented in a way that makes people start to question if their ways or their beliefs are actually all that good, if there's any real merit, or if maybe we should just reject them outright because of how bad they are in concept. In other words, my fear with the Acolyte wasn't that I might see a couple Jedi fail or make some bad decisions or do something stupid or fall to the dark side or something like that. You can absolutely do a story like that if you want, though from time to time it would be kind of nice to see the Jedi making the right calls and truly being the ideal we should see them as. But I have no issue with a story that shows a Jedi or a few Jedi making the wrong choices and there being consequences. After all, I love the prequels, and that's a story about a Jedi making some wrong choices and there being consequences. I just don't want to, again, see the ideal that is the Jedi torn down on the whole. I don't want a story set 100 years before the prequels showing how the Jedi Order is becoming corrupted or something. That was truly my greatest fear when it came to this show, that it would show a Jedi Order in some sort of failing state 100 years before the prequels. Which I think completely misses the point of the prequels and does a huge disservice to the story, to the message, a valuable message that George Lucas was trying to convey with those films. Because, I mean, if the Jedi during the prequels are this mostly corrupted or misguided and just overall not very good or well-functioning organization, if it's been in decline for over 100 years or more at this point, or that maybe it's always been flawed, Well, then Palpatine exploiting that very obvious decline and defeating them is, well, you can call it a good story still, I guess, but it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't say anything if evil defeated the good guys who were already declining or being corrupted from within, or that they were so worried about their reputation that they ignored or covered things up, like incidents with dark side users, for the sake of that reputation, which is an implication the Acolyte seems to be making. However, if Palpatine instead defeated a Jedi Order that was still more or less strong on the whole and doing good in the galaxy, that hadn't lost its way completely or even at all really, one that only had one small crack showing in the armor, that being, as Yoda says in Attack of the Clones, that they were becoming a bit too sure of themselves, if that's what the greatest flaw of the Jedi is, that after not seeing a legitimate dark side threat in 1,000 years, which is what that line from Ki-Adi-Mundi is supposed to mean, if after all that time they started to feel some relief, they started to think they'd won once and for all over evil and kind of let their guard down a bit, well then it becomes a much more profound story or message about just how dangerous evil can be, that it only takes letting their guard down a little, and for a moment, for it to gain the foothold it needs to ultimately win. So many people think the prequels are meant to condemn the Jedi for their utter failure, that this was an organization doomed to fail because of problems from within. But I would say the point of the prequels is that it doesn't take much for evil to win. It simply takes you becoming a little too sure of yourself and giving evil the opportunity to get back in and to take advantage. The prequels are meant to be a story about why all of us should always remain vigilant, why we should always be on the lookout for the return of evil, why we must never let our guard down, not even for a moment. Because if we're not careful, evil will weasel its way back in without us even noticing, and maybe we'll even be welcoming it back with thunderous applause. And so that was my biggest fear going into The Acolyte. I thought what it was going to be, I thought what Headland might try to do is write a show, and perhaps write it well, that would undermine the message about the dangers of evil in favor of a story that shows how the Jedi Order were failing long before Palpatine ever came along. That he simply exploited obvious flaws, and it would now undersell the dangers of evil and the dangers of good becoming complacent instead of remaining vigilant, in favor of making a point about how institutions that become corrupted allow evil to thrive. I mean, yeah, that's pretty obvious. But I'm happy to say I was wrong about the show. It's not that at all, though not for a lack of trying, I think. I do believe Headland wanted to, or thought she did, or would score some points against the Jedi, and was indeed painting them as a flawed or even failing organization, or one that misused its power and tried to control the way others use the Force, and that's what would turn around and be the cause of their demise. Which is what that line from Mother Anastasia seems to try and say or imply. The thing she says right before she dies about how those noble intentions will someday lead to the destruction of the Jedi. And though I'm sure there are some out there, those who, for whatever reason, want to see the Jedi painted as the villains, or that just don't understand what Star Wars is really all about or trying to say to you, but I'm sure there are those out there who cheered and thought, haha, she told the Jedi she knew what their big mistake or flaw was. But their biggest mistake was far from noble intentions. It was again letting their guard down and not seeing the evil right in front of them because they thought they had defeated it for good. And that again was when evil struck. And so, unfortunately for Headland, who I can only assume really wanted to make some type of point about something with this show, but nothing here, nothing in The Acolyte is all that compelling. Nothing has the teeth to really sink in and make any kind of impact. Sure, we see a couple Jedi doing some sketchy things. We even see a group of them decide to lie to the Jedi Council and to a little girl, but they do it for her benefit or to spare her from the truth or the pain that would come from it, which I'm not saying makes it right. I'm just not so sure that is the greatest sin I have ever witnessed. We also, through 7 episodes, and yes, there is one more to go and who knows what will happen in it, but we have these tiny things here and there about how the Jedi, or how one of them, that being Venestra Rose, but she is seemingly worried about their reputation, and that is going to lead to, I guess we're supposed to assume, problems down the road, or even a cover-up about the return of the Sith. But honestly, that's not really saying anything about the Jedi. That's her doing. That's her having this fear about the Jedi's reputation. There's nothing here that makes any sort of real case against them with it. Nor is there anything with Khmer and him wanting freedom, and how the Jedi are denying him that. Because the Jedi, of course, would deny him the type of freedom he wants, the type he's talking about. The freedom to do whatever the hell he wants, including killing people. Then there is the witches, who are participating in dark side magic, and who, when the Jedi come to question them about the twins that they have seen, they decide to invade the mind of one of them, of a child basically, and I can only assume to turn him against the Jedi, or to make him perhaps act rashly, so that later on the witches can retaliate against the Jedi. And what is curious about all of this, the story of the witches, and after what Headland talked about before the show came out, about how the Jedi try to monopolize the Force or something, how this show is going to be about power and who gets to use it, well, it turns out that what the Jedi Council thought was best in this situation was to just leave the witches and the twins alone, to let them be. Period. The Council, the Jedi, thought they had no real right to interfere with the witches and that they should be allowed to live how they see fit. So I'm not so sure how this is a story about power and who gets to use it, about the Jedi overstepping their bounds, perhaps, and dictating who does and doesn't get to use the Force and how. Though perhaps the funny or maybe ironic part is that even if Headland had made some sort of interesting and well thought out case against the Jedi in this series, she kind of completely undermined herself in a recent interview with Collider when she said, "I can understand that fans, especially people who don't know the High Republic, may feel like I'm criticizing the Jedi as they exist in George Lucas's of Ra, meaning the prequels in episode 5 through 6. But that's not the case. We're so much further back than that. We're in the era that Obi-Wan is talking about in A New Hope. We're in that period where the proliferation of power is so huge and far-reaching. Actually, in the next episode, you're going to see how far-flung particular missions with the Jedi are, and the lack of oversight." And first of all, very quickly, Obi-Wan said that the Jedi had been the guardians of peace and justice for 1,000 generations, or for roughly 25,000 years. I really don't think he was kind of referring to your little project here. He wasn't saying just 100 years ago this is how the Jedi were. He was talking about their whole history. Their whole very, very long history that goes back well before your show is set a mere 100 years before he said it. Also, oddly enough, you're acknowledging that what you're doing with the show has nothing to do with George Lucas's version of the Jedi. You're saying you had to go back in time to a time that George Lucas did not create, and that was created after he had sold and thus has given no approval of whatsoever, and I'm talking about the High Republic. And so you went back to this new time period that he didn't have any input on, and you came up with your own story, your own version of the Jedi essentially in this time period, and you did it in order to criticize them and their proliferation of power, which is not going to be a problem 100 years later because you said it wasn't the same Jedi or the same issues, I would imagine, and thus you're kind of saying it doesn't align with what we will see in the prequels and the OT in regards to the Jedi. You're saying these aren't even George Lucas Jedi, they're something different that you're criticizing. And that's a strange thing to say or admit, though yeah, I guess I'm happy you did. I guess I'm happy that you cleared up that you weren't trying to criticize the Jedi as George Lucas saw them, as the ideal he saw them as. You're not trying to take down the real Jedi, though I hate to break it to you, but even if you were, it wouldn't have accomplished it. And so in closing, I'm happy to say that I was dead wrong about the show. I was dead wrong about The Acolyte. It didn't end up being a well-written takedown of the Jedi. It ended up being someone thinking or trying to intentionally set up the Jedi by creating their own version of them and setting it in a time period that they had created as well. This isn't even the High Republic. This is years after what we've seen from it. And so you made up your own Jedi, you made up your own time period, and you tried to show the flaws of the Jedi, but still didn't do a very good job of that. And so I guess we could sum up this whole show by saying you made your own little Star Wars fan fiction that really didn't have much to say. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it is your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about any of this, any of what I had to say here, or tell me what you think about The Acolyte. Whatever the case may be, though, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.